Hi, this is Chris Dixon. This is the a16z podcast. I'm here today with my colleagues Benedict Evans and Connie Chan, and we're going to talk about tech in China. So Connie, you spent a lot of time thinking about China. I think just because a lot of people who might be listening to this don't really understand the landscape there, could you just give like a quick overview? Who are the big companies? What do they do? What are they working on?
The big companies people have historically talked about would be, they call them the BAT companies. B stands for Baidu, A stands for Alibaba, and T stands for Tencent. But on top of that, there are some emerging companies like Qihoo that are growing very quickly that are worth paying attention to as well. I think these three companies are actually quite misunderstood, unfortunately, out here in the West. For example, I read a lot of articles that talk about Tencent, and they say that advertising is their main business model. But people don't realize if you just look at their financial statements, advertising is less than 10% of their revenues. And 80% of their revenues are coming from games and value-added services.
So these are like in-app payments on games and things like that?
Yeah. They actually are very active in gaming. Tencent is the creator of one of my favorite mobile apps called Weixin, which in English is called Wechat. It's one of the most innovative messaging apps that I've seen for a long time. That a lot of Chinese now consumers are using to do a number of things outside of just communicating to their friends and family. They're using it to order taxis, to send money, to order food from restaurants, to follow celebrities, to get local traffic, all sorts of things. Alibaba is the other company I mentioned. They have a number of huge properties. Tmall and Taobao are probably the two most well-known ones that are massive players in e-commerce. Aliyun is also a cloud product that they have, as well as Alipay, which is somewhat similar to PayPal here in the States. Baidu is often called the Google of China, and that's because they're dominant in search, also very dominant in maps. In addition to those two properties, they have a couple other ones, but those are the two that they're mostly known for. And the one that I mentioned earlier, Qihoo, they started in security, but now they're starting to get into search and other mobile products too.
Are there any U.S. websites, web services that are large in China? Google hasn't succeeded against Baidu.
Yeah, a number of U.S. companies have attempted to go out there. Some are more successful than others. In the last couple of years, some of the Silicon Valley-backed startups, such as Flipboard, LinkedIn, Evernote, have tried to go out there, and some of them are doing quite well.
Who's doing well there?
LinkedIn is a recent player that just launched, and I know they have huge aspirations to hire a lot of people. So that's one that's worth watching. Evernote has found a really good team in Beijing, and I think they really benefited from having a good local partner. They're working with CVC Capital, who is also the same team that brought out LinkedIn.
It's interesting listening. There's a sort of generalized, sort of slightly naive idea that somehow the Chinese are stuck behind the Great Firewall of China and that they're desperate to use Facebook and Google. And actually, they've kind of got their own internet and it's just as good as ours and actually much more innovative in some ways.
Now, so the cynical view, though, is that they effectively blocked the U.S. companies and the state there sponsored these successful companies.
Yeah, but if you look at, say, Japan or South Korea, they're not behind a firewall, and those US companies haven't done any better there. I mean, they've got a few exceptions. But it's more that you could sort of turn it the other way and say it's more that where you have a country that's actually big enough to sustain real-scale businesses and has a fundamentally different language and culture, then it's quite hard for Amazon or Google to roll in. Whereas what happened in, a small European country or, some other part of the world is you didn't really have the scale or the language barrier to allow a domestic company to really grow.
What about like Germany or something? Like they use mostly U.S. services, right?
Yeah, but Germany's much, much smaller.
Okay.
I mean, Germany's half the size of the UK in internet terms.
I guess to your point, India has a lot of its own services.
Exactly. India has its own services, but even there it's not protected by language.
I see.
And I think it's interesting if you think about how you actually define innovation. If you think of it as also business models and monetization, there's a lot of innovation happening out in China. And I think a big mistake that people make is they look at a company and they say, oh, this is the Facebook of China, this is the Yelp of China, this is the Groupon of China or YouTube of China. And most of the time, that's just to too simplistic of a way to kind of summarize what these companies do. And most of these companies have multiple business models behind them, and they monetize in ways that are very different than their United States.
Do you think that's because they're ahead of the United States counterparts, or because it's a different culture?
I think it depends on which product. So for something like messaging, I think they're ahead. Something like logistics, I think they're ahead. Online video, I actually think they're more experimental as well. And then some of it is cultural.
And so, for example, messaging, they're ahead. What does that mean for U.S. or let's say non-China based messaging? Like, what will be does that have implications for WhatsApp, for example?
I actually think it's a positive that you can learn and see what's working in China, because China's just a land where there's so much experimentation going on, and there are lots of startups going after every single industry. And if you look at the companies that are going into messaging in China, Weixin is obviously the biggest one, but there are a couple other players too. Every single one of them is coming up with something innovative that I haven't seen in a lot of messaging companies in the U.S. yet.
So, like, if you had to predict then, if WhatsApp were to copy them, what would they do to monetize?
Well, WeChat has a number of ways they can monetize in the future, right? And I think part of it is linking that application with all the other services that Tencent has.
So link it to the taxi app and the games and kind of think of it almost as its own operating system.
Well, that's the weird thing about WhatsApp is it's the biggest and it's the only one that's not trying to do any of this stuff. So obviously WeChat is the standard bearer for trying to use the messaging platform and messaging as a platform to do lots of other cool stuff,
right?
Which Facebook did on the desktop. And Line is trying to do globally as well. But WhatsApp very deliberately said we're not going to do anything other than this extremely narrow and extremely deep focus.
But I think, to Connie's point, what the Chinese example suggests is that you can layer on monetization in a way that doesn't annoy people.
Yeah, and I think there's a big point around, what is the right channel for getting this stuff to people? Is it going through Google? Is it going through Facebook? Is it going through the App Store? Is it going through some sort of social messaging system? Which,
right.
Facebook built on the desktop, but they haven't really built that on mobile.
And some of those apps, for example, WeChat monetizes in the U.S. by selling sticker packs. And I know stickers aren't necessarily as successful out here than they are in a lot of the Asian countries, but it is one way that they're monetizing users here.
Yeah, it's like Asians like stickers and Westerners like filters. There's this kind of divide.
Well, I also think that a lot of the stickers I see in China are very innovative, actually. So rather than just sharing a single expression, that moving animated GIF actually captures an entire phrase. So it's not just someone looking sad. It's someone looking sad because they're hungry. It's someone looking sad because they're tired. And so the emoticons, I actually think, are even more creative out in Asia than they are here.
So a lot of these companies now seem to be interested in entering the U.S. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. There are a number of them that are coming out here, and in several different ways, too. One way is actually just straight up investing in a lot of U.S. companies. And so a lot of...
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that, like in our investments, seeing them as co-investors.
Yeah, and so that interest
and they're pitched to entrepreneurs as we can help you enter China and teach you about what we've learned from China.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly. But that interest is coming from not just the major strategics like the Tencent, Alibaba, and the Qihus. They are very active out here. But it's also coming, now I see, from China VCs. And actually even sovereign wealth funds around Asia. There's just a lot of interest in diversification, in getting more learning from the United States, and being in closer relationship with a lot of these companies.
So one of the things that I think sort of seems to be going on now is that you're having a kind of a sort of a war in mobile between the bat companies. And so they're all kind of aggressively moving into each other's spaces. And it seems like you're getting some bleed out of that into the rest of the world. So obviously we had Tencent. Who was it that took a stake in Tango? I can't remember now.
Alibaba.
Yeah, so Alibaba took a stake in Tango. Yeah. Because Tencent is strong in messaging, it seems. So there's this kind of...
Well, they had another messaging product already that wasn't doing as well.
So are these guys going to... Are the bat companies going to try to come into the U.S. and go head-to-head against... Is Baidu going to try to take on Google in the U.S.? Or are they going to come in and that strongly?
I don't think that's necessarily that strategy, but in terms of learning and investing in the States, I do think
so it's more of
that all of these companies will ramp up that
scouting mission
effort.
and not an invasion yet.
I wouldn't call it an innovation, but I do think there's a lot of ways to find mutual cooperation or mutual learning. And it's funny, actually, when I go to China, a lot of my friends out there, they read TechCrunch or they read Pando Daily, and they read a lot of the tech blogs we read out here because a lot of those articles get translated into Chinese almost immediately. And it just shocks me how many people out in Silicon Valley don't do the same in reverse, because there are actually a lot of companies we can learn from in China.
What would you recommend that English-speaking Americans read?
The English sites, there aren't that many, but Tech in Asia is one that I like. TechNode is another one.
Okay.
So those are two that are in English that have daily coverage. But like you were saying earlier, a lot of the Chinese companies are coming out here. Sometimes it's to invest. Sometimes it's actually to bring U.S. hardware products out to Chinese consumers. So that's a growing trend as well. And anything that we see out here, for example, like a Jawbone, the Up band is actually very popular in China. And so there are a number of commerce companies in China that would just love to be distribution partners for hardware companies out here.
I mean, the interesting part of China from the sort of point of view of the broader mobile ecosystem is that although Apple is present in China and is doing well selling iPhones and iPads, obviously clearly by far the biggest smartphone platform in China is Android, but it's Android without Google. So you have even Samsung, and even I actually used a Motorola phone a couple of weeks ago that was being sold in China and had no Google services on it at all. So you've almost got two Androids. And there's 2/3 of Android, which is the one that Google gives numbers for, is outside China.
Right.
And then there's another third of Android, which is in China and doesn't have Google Play on it or Google Maps on it. And yet it's still potentially in a market. So you've got these Chinese app stores that are starting to look at whether they can get foreign developers to come in and sell to Chinese consumers.
Yeah, and that brings up a great point that I think is another thing that a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs should be aware of, which is that just by putting your application on Google Play doesn't mean you're getting distribution in China. There are a ton of other app stores, and even the top strategic companies all have their own as well, that you need to have close relationships with and have special promotion partnerships with if you want your apps to get distributed. Google Play, I believe, is less than 10% of Android app downloads.
Umain gave a number of 6% of the installs on their network.
Yeah. So all of my friends, for example, who are born in China, who use devices, none of them are using Google Play to download apps. They're all using these third-party services.
Yeah, and that's not even a piracy issue, it's just the nature of the ecosystem there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a function of a lot of the Chinese developers are directly giving their applications to those companies instead. And those are often the app stores that get preloaded on a lot of the devices that get sold in China. Because just like you said earlier, a lot of the devices that are sold, it's not preloaded with Google services. So they don't have Google Play to use. They have to go separately download it if they even want it. And therefore, oftentimes, consumers will just use whatever app store is preloaded on that particular device.
Right.
And it also makes sense that I think Google services aren't readily available on those devices because, to be quite honest, a lot of Google products are difficult to use when you are in China. They're either slower to load or, for example, the maps, I believe they don't have the correct license right now. I'm not 100% sure on that. But
yeah, I think Apple has licensed maps in China. It's kind of weird because if you look at China on an iPhone from outside China, you see like one road in the whole country. But if you're in China, then you see these really, really good maps.
They don't have the rights to send do their satellite imagery.
But then it's not even the satellite, it's just the street maps. But then when you're in China, you get really, really good maps for China that Apple's licensed in China, but then you don't see any roads anywhere else in the world. So they've got this kind of weird licensing thing going on. And of course, for some strange reason, the Chinese didn't want Google to drive its cars all over China to build their own maps. So Google doesn't have its own kind of ground truth maps for China. So they'd have to license them as well.
But, even on the mapping front, while Baidu is the market leader there, I looked at Tencent's mapping product recently, and their Street View was phenomenal technology.
That's an interesting thing. Interested to see if you agree with me, but I kind of have the impression that the function of having these three internet giants in China is that whereas outside you have, Amazon is one e-commerce and Facebook one social and Google one maps and search, and nobody else is even trying to do maps really. I mean, Apple's trying, but not on the web. Whereas in China you've generally got 2 or even 3 companies are doing something pretty good in most spaces. So it might be that they're not necessarily quite as good as Google Maps might be in San Francisco, but you've actually got a lot more competition going on. Is that kind of a fair view?
I do think there's more competition in China, and it's around every single possible business opportunity. It's also just a function. There are more people there. There are more startups there, right? And I do also see this changing, though. I mean, as you look at all the acquisitions that Facebook has been making recently, you can easily foresee them acquiring more things that don't naturally seem like they're social on the outset.
Certainly it happened with Google, and it seems like it might be happening with Facebook now, but like Google, 5 years ago, you predict they buy a thermostat company? Like, no way, right?
Right.
So they've become much more like the GEs of technology or something.
Right.
Kinds of conglomerates. So let's end up maybe with do you have a few predictions you'll make about the Chinese companies or the future?
Well, I think there are a couple areas that China's really innovating on. And I do think some of the newest, coolest features will come out of Asia, particularly around logistics. I've seen a lot of same-day delivery companies try and create startups around Silicon Valley, around San Francisco, but I look at logistics, and that's a problem that China's been tackling for same-day delivery for the last five plus years, right? And so logistics, because...
And who's the big logistics company there? Is it Alibaba?
Well, there are several, and a lot of the e-commerce players have their own logistics teams as well. So, for example, a lot of people talk about Jingdong because they can do same-day delivery within a handful of hours, sometimes as quick as 4 hours, within a large city like Beijing. But I think logistics is one area that China can be really innovative in because they've been forced to. If you look at populations in Beijing and Shanghai, those cities are so densely packed, and they also have the added benefit of very low labor costs, so they can be very experimental in figuring out the best customer experience and whether or not they should, for example, take an area of a map and break it off into squares, or are circles actually more efficient than squares because there's overlap. These are all things that they've been tackling over the last 5 years, and so in that area particularly, I think there's a lot of learning to do from China. E-commerce is another one where I think it's going to be really interesting to watch, because something that's misunderstood about China is that the second and third tier cities are very different than the first tier cities. And oftentimes, if you go to a third or fourth tier city, they don't have a local mall, a local drugstore that's within driving distance or walking distance. And so some of those places, they're really skipping and going not from just having a village and they're going to a mall, but they're skipping the mall portion and going straight to buying online. And so just online adoption, and then the logistics challenges around that, I think, are going to be really interesting to watch. Messaging, I mentioned earlier, is an area I think that Asia's just going to be very innovative in. Education is another one. Education and mobile payments, those are two areas that I'm starting to look at China for innovation too.
All right, great. Thanks.